The storm came through on a Tuesday night and left before Wednesday arrived, fast, indifferent, and far more destructive than anything that moves so quietly has any right to be. I was awake before it finished. I lay in the dark of my apartment, listening to the wind press itself against the windows, and I thought about the farm the way I always thought about it at 3 in the morning. Not with any plan. Just with the low, persistent ache of a man who knows something important is sitting 47 miles away, and isn't yet sure he deserves to go back. Margaret had loved that farm completely, without apology. When her father left her the property outside town, she walked every acre of it with mud on her boots and came back to the house with her eyes bright. She planted the rose garden our second spring there. She carried the oak home herself, a sapling wrapped in burlap in the back of her Jeep. Over the years it grew into something that made visitors stop and simply look, the way people stop for things that took a very long time to become what they are. 3 years ago, I stood beside that oak and watched them lower Margaret into the ground, 20 feet from its roots. After that, I went back to the city and stayed there, because every corner of the farm spoke in her voice, and I wasn't always strong enough to listen. My phone rang at 12 minutes past 5. It was Carol, who had managed the property for 18 years. She didn't call before sunrise unless waiting felt irresponsible. The old oak came down, she said, her voice tight with the effort of holding itself steady. The root ball pulled clean out of the ground. It took most of the rose bed with it. She stopped. There's a hole out there, Mr. Bennett. 4 feet deep, maybe 6 across. Another pause. And there's something else. Something you need to see yourself. I dressed in the dark, left half a cup of coffee on the counter, and drove. 53 minutes on the highway, the fields still gray and flattened from the storm. On the way, I called the restoration crew I'd used before. They said they could be out within the hour. I told them to come. Carol was at the edge of the hole when my headlights swept across the garden. The oak lay across the rose bed like something that had surrendered rather than fallen, its root ball rising higher than I was tall. The north fence was gone. The irrigation line lay in broken sections across the mud. I got out of the truck. The air smelled of turned earth, wet wood, and something older, something that had been underground a long time. Carol turned to face me, and before she said a word, her expression made my throat tighten. Mr. Bennett. Look at what's in the hole. I walked to the edge and looked down. A steel box, wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting and bound with electrical tape gone stiff with age, sat cradled between 2 severed roots. Someone had sealed it with the care of a person who intended it to last a very long time in the ground. On the lid, scratched by hand, letter by careful letter, were 2 words. Asterisk Richard. Open this alone, asterisk. My legs went unsteady beneath me. Not from weakness. From the recognition of that handwriting, the slight forward lean of the capital R, the deliberate care of every letter. The unmistakable signature of a woman who believed that how you wrote something said as much as what you wrote. Carol, I said. Give everyone the morning off. She nodded once and walked toward the barn without another word. I stood at the edge of that hole and looked down at what my wife had buried beneath her oak tree. Then I climbed down into the earth to get it. The box weighed more than I expected, not from its contents, though I would learn those soon enough, but from the particular heaviness that settles into an object when someone has handled it with unhurried, deliberate purpose. Margaret had sealed this the way she sealed everything she considered permanent. 3 layers of heavy plastic, each one taped independently before the next went on. She had not been careless. She had never been careless about anything. I carried it up to the kitchen and sat down at her table, pine from an estate sale, refinished by her own hands over 2 weekends, scarred with 30 years of coffee rings and garden catalogs. I cut through the plastic with my pocket knife. The steel underneath was cold and slightly damp, but sound. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, a letter on cream stationery, folded in thirds. A green composition notebook. Bank statements clipped in chronological order. Invoices from gambling operations, dressed up to look like something else. Loan documents. And beneath all of it, internal company records bearing a header I recognized immediately. My hands were shaking, not the fine tremor of age, but the deep shake of a man whose body understood something his mind was still refusing. I unfolded the letter. She had written plainly, the way she always wrote when she'd run out of better options. Daniel, our son, had been stealing from the company systematically for over a year. She had found the first discrepancy 14 months before she died, and had spent 8 months quietly verifying it before she put a single word on paper. Asterisk, I didn't tell you because you were 3 weeks out of cardiac surgery, and I had just gotten my diagnosis. I buried this here because the company's lawyer is not mine. I had no lawyer of my own. There was no one to call who wasn't in some way connected to the company Daniel was stealing from. The tree was the only thing that belonged to no one but me. It has stood 80 years. I thought it would stand long enough. Asterisk. I set the letter down with both hands because I couldn't trust one. My face was wet. Somewhere in that last paragraph, I had started to cry, not the managed grief I'd learned to carry these past 3 years, but something raw, something from a place I hadn't known was still this open. I opened the composition notebook to the first page. Asterisk Daniel. March 14th. $847,000. Asterisk. My phone rang. The screen read Daniel. I have learned, in 40 years of running a business, that the first thing you do when the phone rings with bad news is breathe before you speak, because the tone of your voice in the first 10 seconds sets the temperature of everything that follows. I breathed. I picked up. Dad. His voice carried a controlled urgency I'd taught him without meaning to. We have a situation with the Meridian shipment. Customs flagged the manifest. The whole container sitting in a federal examination facility. The penalty clause kicks in after 72 hours. We're at hour 19. We need to post $3 million as a customs bond to stop the clock. I've already drawn up the paperwork. The farm is the cleanest collateral we have. If you sign tonight, I can have funds posted by 9. The farm. Margaret's farm. The property where, not 40 minutes earlier, I had climbed into the earth to retrieve what she'd left me. I kept my voice easy. What about Frank? Frank Doyle had been my chief financial officer for 35 years. Nothing of this size moved without his sign-off. Frank's been looped in, Daniel said a beat too quickly. Not Frank called me. Not Frank confirmed. Just the passive, unverifiable claim. Walk me through the account, I said. The specific one the funds go to. It's a holding account through the brokerage handling the release. Garrett Shaw set it up. He's been running the legal side since last night. Garrett Shaw. I didn't recognize the name, and I filed it away with the attention of a man who had learned that unfamiliar names are sometimes the most important ones. 3 things were wrong. Customs escrow accounts don't run through private brokerages. Frank hadn't called me, which meant either he didn't know, or he knew and was being kept from raising the alarm. And the farm was mine alone, held outside the company entirely. Daniel had no authority to pledge it as collateral without my agreement. I said none of this. Bring the paperwork tonight, I told him. I'll be here. Dad. The timeline. I understand the timeline, Daniel. Drive safe. I ended the call and pressed both palms flat against Margaret's table, breathing through my nose for 10 slow seconds. My heart wasn't racing. It was beating with the heavy deliberateness of a clock that understood it had important work ahead. I read the notebook for 12 minutes. Then I called Frank Doyle. Frank. Archive room, side entrance. Don't log the visit. The notebook had 116 pages. Margaret had used 83 of them, 14 months of work, every entry dated, every figure cross-referenced, every discrepancy traced back to its source with the patience of a woman who understood that the difference between a problem and a disaster is usually just a matter of how long it goes unexamined. My wife had been dying, and she had spent 14 months building a case. The early entries were in her ordinary, relaxed cursive, the handwriting of grocery lists and garden notes, as if she hadn't yet decided whether what she was seeing mattered. By the fourth entry, the handwriting had changed. Smaller. More deliberate. The handwriting of a woman who had decided this was real. Daniel had been routing inventory through 4 consulting firms, each registered to a different name, each operating out of mail forwarding addresses. The payments were small enough to slip under automatic review. The invoices described vague services, market analysis, logistics optimization, that would pass a casual audit. But Margaret had pulled every one of them. She'd called 2 of the forwarding services herself, posing as a vendor, confirming addresses. She'd cross-referenced registration dates against payment dates. Every firm had been created within 60 days of its first invoice to us, and every one had stopped filing within 18 months of its last payment. My hands were trembling now with something colder than grief. On June 7th, the first gambling record appeared. 14 transactions over 6 months. Total outflow, $312,000. The account replenished each time from the consulting firm payments. He's been cycling it. I pushed back from the table so hard the chair scraped the floor, and walked out onto the porch, gripping the railing with both hands. Carol found me there with 2 mugs of coffee. She hadn't asked if I wanted one. She'd simply brought 2, which told me everything about what she'd read in my face. She used to come out here early, Carol said quietly. The autumn before she got sick. 5:30 in the morning. I'd see the kitchen light, then she'd go out with her notebook. I never asked what she was writing. Figured it was her business. My eyes burned. She was the most capable person I have ever known, I said, and my voice broke slightly on the last word. Carol looked at me, her eyes bright in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She knew, she said. Mr. Bennett, she knew. The last entry Margaret ever wrote, before her handwriting became too unsteady to continue, was dated November 3rd. Asterisk, there's one name that keeps appearing at the edges of the larger transactions. Garrett Shaw. He's listed as legal counsel on 2 of the consulting firm registrations. Wherever the money gets complicated, his name is nearby. Richard will need to find out what I couldn't. Asterisk. The same name Daniel had given me 40 minutes earlier. The lawyer managing the fake customs dispute. The man setting up the wire. I picked up my keys and walked out to the truck. I hadn't used the chairman's private entrance in 4 years, a card that predated the building's main security system by a decade, riding quietly on my keyring. I badged in without crossing the lobby, without passing a single camera on the standard system, and rode up to the 4th floor. Frank was already in the archive room, the door pulled shut, only the low workmanlike lighting on. He had the expression I'd seen from him only twice in 35 years, the look of a man who'd known something was seriously wrong before he was in a position to say so. You already knew, I said. It wasn't an accusation. It was recognition. I knew something was wrong, he said. I didn't know the shape of it. Numbers weren't reconciling for 2 quarters, and every time I tried to trace it, it disappeared into the consulting invoices. I was building a report. I wanted something concrete before I brought it to you. I should have come to you sooner. You're here now, I said. Tell me what you found. He turned over the first document. The monitoring system for Warehouse 3 was disabled at 11:47 last night. Not a malfunction, a clean, deliberate shutdown, 4 hours and 20 minutes, restored at 4:12 this morning. 40 minutes before storm damage would have drawn anyone's attention. He moved to the next page. Your access credentials to the freight system were restricted at 6:15 this morning. By Daniel's administrator account. My stomach dropped, not from the information itself. I'd suspected something like this since the third page of the notebook, but from the confirmation. Suspicion and confirmation are different countries, and the border between them is not comfortable. What else? I said. Frank hesitated. 3 weeks ago, Daniel filed a transfer of record with the Secretary of State's office, forming a new holding company. He moved a partial interest in the company's operating assets into it, structured as a tax reorganization. The paperwork crossed my desk. I flagged it, asked him to hold. He told me you'd already approved it verbally and would send documentation. His jaw tightened. It never came. I should have pushed harder. What does that transfer do to us if we pursue legal action? It creates an ownership dispute. If Daniel contests, he can argue the holding company has a legitimate claim and request a court freeze on all business activity, pending resolution. That freeze could realistically last 12 to 18 months, during which our 340 employees would be working for a company legally prohibited from operating. The room went very quiet. He built a kill switch, I said. That's one way to describe it. Something moved under Frank's careful precision, something that sounded, if I wasn't mistaken, like grief. Not for the company. For me. Richard. I am sorry. He caught himself. I called Marcus Webb before you arrived. Didn't tell him why. Just that I needed him here. He's pulling in now. Marcus Webb had been our outside counsel for 22 years, thin, still in the way of men who forget to eat when they're thinking, with the particular stillness of someone who'd spent 2 decades in rooms where the wrong word cost people everything. He walked in with his reading glasses already on, looked at me, looked at Frank, looked at the documents. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. It took 11 minutes. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he set his pen down and was quiet for exactly 4 seconds, the silence of a man running calculations, not one at a loss for words. The Delaware transfer is the most urgent problem, he said. If Daniel activates that dispute mechanism before we can freeze it, we lose the ability to move quickly. I can file for a temporary restraining order. A duty judge can review it within 48 hours if we show imminent, irreparable harm. Given what's in that notebook, and what Frank has here, I believe we can make that case. He looked at me over his glasses. But Richard, this isn't only a civil matter. What you've described is wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit bank fraud. Federal crimes. This needs to go to the FBI. The word landed in the room like something physical. I looked at Frank. He looked back at me with the expression of a man who'd been waiting for someone to say it out loud, and wasn't relieved, but was glad it had finally been said. Make the call, I told Marcus. He was already reaching for his phone when Frank's finger stopped on a line near the bottom of a freight printout. He looked up, and his face told me what he'd found before he said a word. Richard. The ship hasn't left port. The container's still in the originating facility overseas. It hasn't cleared customs there yet. The air went out of the room. There's no customs hold, I said. There is no customs hold, Frank confirmed. There is no penalty clock. The shipment Daniel described to you this morning doesn't exist in the form he described it. He manufactured the entire scenario. I sat down because my legs had decided, without consulting me, that standing was no longer something they were willing to commit to. My phone buzzed. A text from Carol. Daniel just called the office asking where you are. I told him you were at the farm. He asked if you'd open anything from the storm cleanup. My jaw went rigid. He knew about the box. Not specifically, not yet, but he'd been afraid of it for 3 years. And last night the storm had finally answered the question he'd been too afraid to ask. He'd built this entire scenario in a single night. I typed back, *, tell him I'm resting. Don't mention anything else, *. Then I looked up at Marcus. We need to move faster than 48 hours. I know, he said. I'm working on it. He was on the phone for 22 minutes. When he came back, his posture had shifted, the small, permanent shift of a man who's just learned the door he thought he was opening had already been standing open, waiting for him. Special Agent Karen Lowe is 40 minutes out, he said. She runs the Financial Crimes Unit. She knows Garrett Shaw's name. He set his phone down with a precision that told me the weight of what was coming. She's known it for 14 months. The Bureau, it turned out, had spent 6 years building a case against an organized lending network operating across the region, a network that preyed on people in financial desperation, gambling debts, failed investments, people who made decisions they never would have otherwise. Garrett Shaw appeared in their files as a connector. He found distressed borrowers, arranged the loans, and helped structure the money to hide the trail. Daniel's name had surfaced 11 months earlier, tied to a wire transfer through a shell company that wasn't ours. He appeared in the Bureau's records as a probable borrower. My son hadn't just been stealing from our company to feed a habit. He had gone into debt with people who were the subject of a federal investigation. And somewhere along the way, Garrett Shaw had found him and handed him a shovel. Frank laid out 2 contracts side by side, both on our letterhead. This is the legitimate Meridian contract, signed 8 months ago. $12 million, full container of irrigation equipment, for a farming cooperative on the West Coast. He pointed to the second. This is a contract for the same container. Different buyer, a company registered in Nevada 3 months ago. Different delivery address. He looked up. Same equipment. Same container. Same ship. He sold it twice, I said. He sold it twice. The plan, best we can reconstruct, when the container arrives next month, Daniel diverts it to a private warehouse. The equipment goes to the second buyer, who's already paid. Meanwhile, he files an insurance claim saying the container was seized in a customs dispute, the same fiction he gave you this morning. We collect the insurance payout. The real cooperative gets nothing, sues us, and we're left holding a $12 million liability and an insurance fraud exposure, while Daniel is somewhere without an extradition treaty. I pressed both hands flat against the table, needing to feel something solid. The $3 million he asked me to wire this morning, I said. That wasn't for a customs bond. No, Frank said. Based on Agent Lowe's preliminary read, it's a debt payment to the lending network. He needed your signature on the farm to secure the wire, and he needed it to clear before the ship arrived and the scheme became visible. The whole emergency was built to create a window, to panic you into signing before you had time to think. The farm. He needed it specifically, clean title, quick to secure, quick to release. And Marcus added quietly, because it was the one asset entirely outside the company's structure. Tie it up in collateral, ensure the bond never gets returned because there was never a bond to return, and he'd have stripped it from me through paperwork rather than force. Margaret's farm. Margaret's rose garden. Margaret's oak tree, 80 years standing, brought down in a single storm to give up exactly what she'd been keeping it safe for. All right, I said, when I trusted my voice again. Agent Lowe is 40 minutes out. What do we need ready? We spent 2 hours building the rest of the evening, item by item. The documents Daniel would bring tonight would be substituted for versions that looked identical but meant something entirely different. Not a transfer of my authority, but a signed record of Daniel personally presenting fraudulent paperwork and personally naming the account, the amount, and the deadline. The Delaware freeze was already filed. Every account under Daniel's sole authority was flagged for review above $10,000. And at the farm, under Virginia's one-party consent law, anything said in my own home that night, without his knowledge, would be legally admissible. I called Carol. I need you to do something tonight, and I need you to trust me without all the details. Tell me what you need, she said, without hesitation. Make sure the security cameras are recording. All 6 feeds, timestamped, all evening. And let Daniel in like it's any other night. A pause, shorter this time. Mr. Bennett. I've been taking care of this property for 18 years. I know how to answer a door. My throat tightened. Thank you, Carol. Anything else? Make sure there's coffee. The good kind. Something almost like a laugh came through the line. I'll put on the Sumatra blend. She always liked that one best. Agent Lowe arrived with the calm, assessing directness of someone who had spent decades learning to read people quickly and rarely needed to revise the impression. I'm sorry about your wife, she said simply, and because it wasn't rehearsed, it landed harder than it should have. I knew Margaret's name was in our records when she got sick. I didn't know she was building a parallel case. She didn't know she was building one either, I said. She thought she was protecting me. She did both, Lowe said. She laid out the operation in 8 minutes. Her team would stage at the farm that afternoon, out of sight, and move only after I opened the living room door, the signal that Daniel had said enough to close the case for good. Tonight is going to be difficult in ways that have nothing to do with the law, she told me before she left. You're going to sit across from your son and watch him try to take something from you, and you're going to have to let him believe he's succeeding, long enough for him to say the words that convict him. She paused. I've done this 23 years. The people who hold up aren't the ones who feel less. They're the ones who remember why they're doing it. I thought about the notebook. 83 pages, 14 months, a woman writing in a garden she loved at 5 in the morning because pretending had never been something she was built for. I thought about 2 words scratched into a steel lid with her own hand. I remember why I'm doing it, I said. I drove to the farm alone that afternoon, and asked for an hour before anyone else arrived. The October light came in low and amber over the fields, the kind of light that makes even broken things look worth saving. I sat in Margaret's chair on the back porch, the one I hadn't been able to bring myself to sit in for 3 years, and let myself feel the whole weight of the day, not as strategy, just as loss. Carol brought coffee without asking and said nothing, and I was grateful for the nothing. I read Margaret's letter a 4th time in the fading light, and on that reading I found the sentence I had missed 3 times before, tucked quietly into the paragraph before the close, exactly where she'd have wanted me to find it once I was finally ready to look. Asterisk beneath the young oak I planted in the east corner, the one I told you I planted for whoever comes after us, I left something else. Not evidence. Something different. You will know when it is time to look, asterisk. I was still sitting with that sentence when headlights swung across the kitchen window, an hour and 14 minutes early. Daniel had made his decision, and he was no longer in doubt about it. He looked exactly like himself, which was somehow the hardest part. The same charcoal jacket, the same firm handshake he'd used my whole life. Dad, you look tired. Come in, I said. Garrett Shaw came in behind him, mid-40s, unremarkable in the particular way that made people trust him quickly and forget him easily, carrying a briefcase like it held something important. Carol brought coffee without a word and retreated to the doorway. I didn't look at her. Her face would have told me everything I already knew, and I couldn't afford to let mine show any of it. Daniel talked for 11 minutes. The customs hold, the penalty clock, the wire requirements, the collateral structure. His facts were internally consistent, and if I hadn't spent the morning with Frank's freight records spread across a table, I'd have believed every word. But I watched his eyes. Twice they went to the steel box sitting on the counter. The second time, he caught himself and looked back down, but his jaw had tightened, and his hand had curled a fraction of an inch inward on the table. He was afraid of that box. He'd been afraid of it for 3 years, and watching me sit across from it now, apparently untroubled, was costing him something. I gave him nothing. Garrett spoke for 4 minutes with the smooth vocabulary of a man who had explained fraudulent structures to frightened people many times before. I nodded in the right places. I asked one trusting father question about the collateral timeline. Then I picked up the pen and began to read slowly, the way a man reads when he intends to understand every word before he signs it. Page 7 held the clause, printed in the same font, the same size, buried between 2 unremarkable paragraphs, exactly where you'd bury something you needed a trusting man to read past without stopping. In the event the chairman is determined to exhibit diminished capacity, full voting authority would transfer to the vice president of operations, pending board review. I read it twice. The kitchen felt suddenly very warm. Walk me through what this means, I said, my voice perfectly level. Garrett leaned in, pleased to answer. A standard protective provision. Given your cardiac history, it's actually required by the lending institution. The threshold for activation is extremely high. 2 independent medical opinions, a formal board resolution. Purely precautionary. I already knew, from Marcus, that the clause was legally void the moment it appeared in a collateral agreement instead of the bylaws, unenforceable without a vote that had never been called. Daniel didn't know that I knew. He put his hand flat on the table, my own gesture, learned from 30 years of watching me use it. Dad, after the surgery, the doctors recommended this kind of provision for anything you signed. It protects you as much as the company. I should have mentioned it earlier. I'm sorry. I looked at my son and thought about the report he'd surely prepared in advance. One that would call my judgment compromised, my fitness to run what I'd built into something to be reviewed and found wanting. The report that, paired with this clause, would let him walk out of this farmhouse tonight with my signature, my voting authority, my company, while he sat somewhere with no return ticket and watched it all unwind from a distance. What moved through me in that moment wasn't rage. Rage was too simple, too clean. It was the specific, complicated grief of understanding, fully and without remainder, that the person across the table had looked at everything I had built, and everything I had trusted him with, and had decided it was easier to take than to earn. I picked up the pen. I looked at my son, 38 years old, sitting in his mother's kitchen, waiting for his father to sign away what she had left behind, and I held that image as long as I needed to, because I understood I would not look at him the same way again after tonight. Then I signed. I watched his shoulders drop, the involuntary release of a body that believes the danger has passed. Now tell me the wire transfer again, I said, in the voice of a man closing out a routine meeting. The account, the routing, the amount, the deadline. I want it right before I call the bank in the morning. He gave it to me freely. Every number. Then I stood, walked to the living room door, and opened it. Marcus came through first, composed, a man arriving at a meeting he'd been invited to. Behind him, Frank, carrying 35 years of loyalty and a private grief of his own. Then Agent Lowe, and beside her, Agent Mercer, and behind them an investigator from the state attorney's office. Nobody ran. Nobody raised their voice. They moved into the kitchen with the unhurried certainty of people who already knew how the next few minutes would end. Daniel shot to his feet so fast his chair scraped the floor. "What is this? Dad, what did you—" I walked back to the counter, picked up the steel box, and set it in the center of the table between us. His face did something I hadn't seen since he was a child who'd broken something he couldn't fix. A collapse that started behind the eyes before it reached anything trained to hide it. "The documents you presented tonight have been substituted," Marcus said quietly. "Your father's signature transfers no assets and no authority. It confirms that you personally presented this material and personally specified the account, amount, and timeline for the wire you requested. That conversation has been recorded, in full, under one-party consent, on property owned by Richard Bennett, with his prior authorization." Garrett's hand moved toward his briefcase. Agent Mercer stepped in front of the door. Don't Agent Lowe looked at Daniel with the weight of a woman who felt what she was about to do and didn't pretend otherwise. Daniel Bennett. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. His eyes found mine across the table. I didn't look away. I didn't move toward him. I let him see my face clearly, without concealment, because he deserved at least that much from me. At the door, he stopped once and turned back, his mouth working around a word that never came. Then the door closed behind him. The room took a long moment to understand it was over. Garrett Shaw's composure had gone somewhere unreachable, replaced by the blankness of a man running calculations and finding none of the answers he needed. I want to cooperate, he said, his voice smaller now, stripped of its polish. That conversation happens with your own counsel present, Lowe said. Not tonight. They led him out the side door, the one Margaret always used when she came in from the garden with mud on her boots. Marcus stayed to work through next steps with the investigator. Frank stood by the window on the phone with the bank. I pulled out my chair at the head of the table, the one that faced the garden, and sat with the steel box in front of me and the smell of Margaret's tomato soup still warm on the stove. My hands were steady. I had expected them to shake, and they didn't, and I understood why. The shaking had been anticipation, and anticipation was finally finished. What was left was not relief and not triumph. It was the quiet, exhausted clarity that comes after something very large has finally been set down. Frank left first. He shook my hand longer than usual, tighter than usual, his grip trembling slightly against mine. Go home, Frank, I said. Get some sleep. He nodded and walked out without looking back. Marcus stayed 20 more minutes confirming the freezes, the filing, the notifications. Get some rest, he said at the door. Tomorrow will be difficult in different ways. I know, I said. Then it was just Carol and me, 2 cups going cold at the table, the October quiet settling over the farmhouse the way it always did when everything else had stopped. She would have handled tonight better than I did, I said eventually. Carol wrapped both hands around her mug. She would have cried in the bathroom first, she said, and then come out and handled it perfectly, and never mentioned the crying to anyone. Something moved through my chest, not quite a laugh, not quite a sob, the complicated cousin of both. That's exactly right, I said. That's exactly what she would have done. I picked up her letter again and read it a 4th time, slower now, and found the same sentence waiting where I'd left it. Asterisk beneath the young oak, I left something else. Not evidence. Something different. You will know when it is time to look, asterisk. I understood, sitting there, that this wasn't a discovery that needed deliberation. It needed action. I took Margaret's old flashlight from the junk drawer, the one she'd insisted every room keep within reach, the one Carol had quietly kept in batteries for 3 years without ever being asked, and walked out past the fallen oak's long shadow, to the young tree in the east corner, the sapling she'd carried home in a burlap sack and planted the fall before her diagnosis. I crouched at its base and dug with my hands, because this felt like something that should be done carefully, the way you handle what belongs to the dead. 8 inches down, my fingers found the edge of something solid, a small tin, rusted at the corners, its lid still sealed against the damp. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small photograph album, its burgundy cover worn soft at the spine from handling. I opened it under the flashlight beam. The first photograph was us. Not posed, early spring in this garden, the rose bed just greening, Margaret laughing with her head tipped back, eyes closed the way they closed when she forgot to be self-conscious about how hard she was laughing. I wasn't looking at the camera. I was looking at her, with an expression I had never once managed to produce on purpose, the look of a man who could not quite believe his luck and had stopped trying to hide it. My chest cracked open. Not broke. Cracked, the way old wood cracks along a line that's been there a while, The stress fracture of 3 years spent holding myself away from anything that felt like this. I turned the pages. Daniel at 6, mud on both knees, grinning like a boy who hadn't yet learned to worry about consequences. Daniel at 18, leaning against a fence post with his arms crossed, trying on the posture of someone who thought he'd already figured things out. Tucked into the back sleeve was another letter, 3 pages, her handwriting shakier now, the hand of her final months. Asterisk Richard. The other box had things you needed to know. This one has things I wanted you to remember. They are different kinds of necessary. Asterisk. Asterisk I am not going to tell you what to do about Daniel. I never could. What I will tell you is this: he is not only what he has done, and you are not only your response to it. Whatever happens, please don't let what he's become be the last word on who your family was. Asterisk. Asterisk I loved this farm because it kept coming back. Hard winters, late frosts, 2 summers of drought that should have finished the rose bed for good, and every spring, without fail, something came back that I had given up on. I think that's the most honest thing I know about living. The things worth keeping aren't the ones that never suffered. They're the ones that suffered and came back anyway. Asterisk. Asterisk I love you. I will always have loved you. Come back to the farm more often. It misses you. I think you know that. Asterisk. Margaret. I sat in the dirt with my back against that young oak and let the tears come without trying to stop them, because she had buried this box for 4 years, waiting for the one night I would finally be ready to sit in the ground and cry without apologizing for it. The least I could do was let her be right. Later, inside, I carried the family album from its shelf and sat with it in Margaret's armchair, turning pages I hadn't let myself look at in 3 years. A plain white envelope slipped out from between 2 pages and fell into my lap. On the front, in handwriting I'd known since he was 7 years old, learning his letters at this same kitchen table, "Mom, please." I opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages, written 2 years before Margaret died, in a hand that wasn't steady, not because Daniel couldn't write steadily, but because steadiness hadn't been available to him that night. Asterisk Mom. I know you know. I've known you know for 6 months, and I've been waiting for you to say something, and you haven't. I want to stop. I've wanted to stop for 2 years and I don't know how anymore. The people I owe are not the kind you negotiate with. I'm not telling you this so you'll fix it. I don't think it can be fixed. I'm telling you because I'm out of places to put it, and you're the only person I've ever been able to tell the truth to, and I haven't been telling you the truth, and I can't keep carrying what that costs. I didn't tell Dad because I can't stand the thought of how he'll look at me when he finds out. I know that's a coward's reason. I know what I've become, and it isn't what I meant to become, and I'm sorry. I don't know how to be sorrier than I am right now. Daniel asterisk. Margaret had kept it. Not hidden, not destroyed, kept in the family album, between the birthdays and the summers on the farm, as if she'd decided it belonged there too. As if she believed the boy who wrote it was still somewhere inside the man he'd become. I sat with my son's letter for a long time, thinking about the distance between the person who wrote it and the person who'd sat across my kitchen table that night, and how much of that distance had been traveled in the wrong direction. Monday morning came without ceremony, the way Monday mornings do. I stood in front of the full leadership team and told them plainly what had happened, that the company had been defrauded from the inside, that the person responsible had been removed, that no client shipment and no paycheck had been touched. I should have seen it sooner, I said. I didn't. I'm sorry for that. Our logistics manager, a careful man not given to speeches, asked simply, "What do you need from us, Mr. Bennett?" "Your ordinary work," I said. "Done the way you always do it. That's what keeps this company standing." Later that morning, a warehouse worker named Luis came to my office, cap in his hands, and told me that months earlier he'd seen unlabeled shipments moving at night and said nothing when a supervisor waved it off. I've been thinking about that every day since I heard what happened, he said. I needed you to know I saw it, and I didn't say anything, and I'm sorry. You're telling me now, I said. That matters. Next time, anything that doesn't sit right, you come straight to me. He left steadier than he'd come in, and I sat for a moment with what he'd left behind, the reminder that the company I'd spent 40 years building was full of people who tried to do right even when the right thing wasn't clear. That, more than any balance sheet, was what I had actually made. 10 days later, I sat across a partition of glass from my son in a detention center that smelled like floor cleaner and old coffee. I hadn't rehearsed anything. 40 years of hard conversations had taught me that the ones that matter most are never the ones you can prepare for. He looked like himself, and he didn't, the composure gone, replaced by something I hadn't seen since he was a teenager who'd done something he couldn't take back. I'm not going to ask you to forgive me, he said. I don't have the right. Tell me when it started. 6 years, he told me. A bad bet through a coworker he thought he could manage. The interest compounding faster than he understood. Every time he thought he was close to clear, the number was bigger. Did you know your mother knew? I asked. He nodded slowly. I knew. I kept waiting for her to say something, and she never did. I told myself she was protecting you. His jaw tightened. I used that. I used her love for you as a reason to keep going. That's the thing I can't get past. Worse than the money. She was giving you time to stop on your own, I said. That's why she didn't tell me. He broke then, all at once, the way something gives when the last support is finally removed. I let him have it, because it was the first real thing between us in a long time. There's something you should know, I told him when he came back. Agent Lowe told me the lending network is the primary target of this investigation. If you cooperate fully, names, accounts, all of it, the U.S. Attorney's Office will consider that. It's not a promise. It's a door. I'll cooperate, he said quietly. All of it. I pressed my hand flat against the glass. After a moment, he raised his and matched it. Make better choices, I said. Starting now. Make the choices the person who wrote that letter would have made. I turned to go. Dad. I stopped, but didn't turn around. Tell me she knew I loved her. She kept your letter in the family album, I said. That was her answer. I came back to the farm on a Saturday morning, 10 days after the storm, not because anything required it, but because I wanted to. And the difference mattered enough that I felt it the moment I turned onto the gravel lane. The hole where the great oak had stood was filled and seeded, the north fence rebuilt on pale new posts that would weather to match the rest in time. The rose bed had been cleared and turned, dark and ready. Carol met me on the porch with coffee. The nursery found the old variety, she said. Same one Margaret planted. They're holding 6. Do you want them? All of them. She smiled, the first full smile I'd seen from her in 10 days, and went inside to make the call. I walked out to the east corner, to the empty tin still waiting under the young oak, and pressed a letter of my own into it, 1 page, written in pencil on the back of a hardware receipt, because that was what I'd had in the truck, and because I thought Margaret would have found that fitting. I covered it, pressed the earth flat with both palms, and stayed there a while in the quiet. Later, at her kitchen table, I opened the small photograph album to its first page and sat with the picture of us laughing in the spring garden for a long time, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. Outside, the October light came over the fence the way it always had, unhurried, and lay itself across the ground where the roses would go in on Monday. I spent 3 years avoiding that farm because every corner of it spoke in her voice. It took a storm, and everything the storm uncovered, to bring me back to myself. I believe the people who love us most aren't always the ones who tell us the truth in time. Margaret tried to protect me, and she was wrong to wait. I was wrong to stop paying attention. My son didn't become who he became overnight. He became it in the spaces I chose not to look. Betrayal like that doesn't arrive loudly. It grows quietly, in the silence between people who stopped asking hard questions. Every family carries two kinds of buried things, the ones meant to destroy you, and the ones meant to save you. Margaret left me both. And as much as it cost, it gave me back the truth, and the chance to start again.